Hundreds of rusted steam locomotives are stranded on the blistering edge of Bolivia's Great Salt Flats, forgotten relics from an age when Uyuni powered an entire mining empire. Imported at huge expense, these engines helped drive Bolivia's boom, only to be cast aside by forces no engineer could stop. Why were so many left to rot here? Impossible to reclaim and impossible to ignore. The answer rewrites the story of ambition, collapse, and the ultimate cost of isolation. Uyuni sits at over 3,650 meters above sea level, perched on the wind-scoured plains of the Bolivian Altiplano. In the late 19th century, this remote outpost became the unlikely crossroads of an ambitious dream: to haul the riches of the Andes across some of the harshest terrain on Earth to the Pacific coast. The logic was geographic as much as economic. The mines of Pulicayo, just 10 kilometers from Uyuni, produced a torrent of silver and tin that demanded a fast, reliable route to international markets. But the Andes stood in the way, towering, jagged, and unforgiving. British engineers hired by Bolivian mining barons and foreign investors surveyed the region with maps and altimeters. They traced the shortest possible corridor from the mines to the coast, searching for a path that could support heavy rail without succumbing to landslides or impassable gradients. Uyuni offered a rare solution: a broad, flat expanse at high altitude perfectly placed between the mineral veins of the interior and the ports of Antofagasta and Arica in Chile. Every major rail line from the southern and central mines converged here, forming a web that funneled ore-laden trains toward the Pacific. The town itself grew around the railway, its streets mapped out to serve steam engines and their cargo. Tracks spread in all directions, north to Oruro, east toward Potosi, and west across the salt flats to Chile. The distances were daunting. From Uyuni to the coast stretched more than 500 kilometers of rails, climbing and descending through mountain passes where oxygen thinned and engines strained against gravity. Yet no other point in the region could offer such a direct junction for so many lines. Uyuni's location, more than any political decree or mining company plan, dictated its destiny as the heart of Bolivia's export machine. Here, geography set the rules, and the rails are followed. Silver and tin from Pulicayo poured out of the mountains in staggering quantities. By the late 1880s, Bolivia was exporting over 20,000 tons of mineral ore every year through Uyuni's rails, nearly a fifth of the global silver supply at the height of the boom. The mines ran day and night, their output so great that entire trains left Uyuni daily, each one loaded with ore destined for the Pacific ports. Silver prices hovered above 90 cents an ounce in the 1880s, generating millions of dollars in revenue and drawing in foreign capital from London and beyond. Payroll records from Pulicayo show hundreds of workers on the books, with wages paid in British pounds and Bolivian bolivianos alike. For every new shaft sunk in the hills, more railway laborers arrived, swelling Uyuni's population by the thousands in just a few years. The demand for transport was relentless. Ore shipments peaked at 25,000 tons a year in the early 1890s, with tin quickly rising to match silver as new deposits were tapped. Locomotives, many shipped straight from British factories, became the backbone of this operation. Each engine could haul up to 100 tons per trip, but even that was not enough. The rail lines soon ran at full capacity, with engineers scrambling to add sidings and expand yards. Uyuni's streets filled with merchants, mechanics, and families drawn by the promise of steady work. A descendant of one of the original railway workers recalls stories of those years: the endless whistle of departing trains, the steady pay that built houses and sent children to school, the sense that Uyuni was at the center of something vast and unstoppable. In those decades, the rails were not just metal, they were lifelines, carrying the wealth of the Andes to the wider world and binding entire communities to the rhythm of the mining boom. Crates stamped with the names Beyer Peacock and Hunslet began arriving in Uyuni between 1890 and 1912. Inside were machines unlike anything the Altiplano had seen. Steam locomotives built in Manchester and Leeds, each weighing between 50 and 70 tons. Export manifests and shipping records detail the journey. Engines were loaded onto ships in Liverpool, offloaded at Antofagasta on the Chilean coast, and hauled by rail across the desert into Bolivia's high country. Makers' plates still bolted to battered boiler shells today bear serial numbers that trace directly back to the British workshops that produced them. These locomotives were more than just tools. They were the arteries of Bolivia's mining economy, engineered for endurance and power. Their steel wheels ground over salt and sand, pulling loads of ore that sometimes reached 100 tons per trip. Bayer Peacock's designs, with their distinctive domed boilers and tall smokestacks, became a familiar sight on the rails. Hunslet's tank engines, compact but formidable, handled the sharp curves and steep grades between Uyuni and the mines at Pulicayo. The National Railway Museum in York catalogues these exports in meticulous detail. One curator describes the engines as the backbone of the Bolivian railways, pointing to builders' drawings and export lists that match the serial numbers still visible in Uyuni's graveyard. Each locomotive represented a significant investment both in British industrial pride and in Bolivia's vision for modernity. The technology was state-of-the-art for its time, capable of withstanding high-altitude cold and the relentless grind of daily ore runs. Bolivia's dependence on these British imports ran deep. The engines were not just purchased, they were relied upon, maintained, and celebrated as the lifelines of a booming mining empire. But with every new shipment, Uyuni's fortunes became more closely tied to distant markets and foreign engineering, a bond that would soon reveal its fragility. In the first years of the 20th century, the global silver market collapsed with a force that stunned Bolivia's mining towns. Silver, once the lifeblood of Uyuni's railways, lost nearly half its value between 1890 and 1900. International price charts from the period show a steady fall from about 90 cents an ounce to barely 50 cents an ounce by the turn of the century. Newspapers in La Paz and London reported on the panic. Mines shuttered, wages slashed, and shipments dwindled. The London Metal Exchange, the world's main reference for silver, recorded a 40% drop in price in less than a decade. For Uyuni, the consequences were immediate. Trains that once left the station daily, loaded with ore from Pulicayo and beyond, now sat idle on their sidings. Railway company ledgers from 1901 show a sharp drop in freight revenue, down by more than one-third in just 2 years. The Bolivian government scrambled to stabilize the currency, but international demand simply was not there. Mining companies, already squeezed by falling ore quality and rising extraction costs, could not weather the downturn. Payrolls were cut, and entire families left Uyuni in search of work elsewhere. Carlos Mesa, a historian and former president of Bolivia, describes this era as a national trauma. He says the silver crash was not just an economic event, it was a social earthquake. Communities built on mining and railways watched their future disappear almost overnight. Commodity graphs from the period tell the rest of the story. As silver prices tumbled, so did Uyuni's fortunes. The railways, once the arteries of a booming export economy, lost their reason to run. By 1903, many of the great engines that had thundered across the Altiplano stood silent, their steel wheels locked in place by nothing more than a change in the world's appetite for silver. The collapse set the stage for what would follow: bankruptcy, abandonment, and the slow transformation of Uyuni's rail yard from the heart of a nation's ambition to a field of rust and memory. Inside the offices of the Ferrocarril de Antofagasta, Bolivia, company secretaries logged one final set of decisions in the early 1900s. With the ledgers bleeding red and the traffic gone, managers faced a choice: What to do with dozens of steam locomotives, each weighing up to 60 tons, now stranded in Uyuni's repair yards? The minutes from those last board meetings are blunt. There would be no funds for dismantling, no money for transport, and certainly no appetite for risking what little remained on salvage. Cost sheets from the period compare the price of moving a single engine, more than the value of its steel if sold for scrap. The numbers did not lie. It was cheaper to let the locomotives sit than to haul them back over the mountains or down to coastal ports. Workshop memos from Uyuni record engines shunted to sidings, awaiting further orders, with the expectation that silver prices or freight demand might someday recover. Mechanics tagged boilers for repair that would never come. Over the course of months, then years, the yard filled with silent machines, each one parked in hope and then quietly forgotten. The logic was entirely practical. Locomotives that might have been stripped for parts in a busier region were left whole, their bulk and weight now a liability no one could afford to address. The terrain itself closed off other options. Uyuni's isolation was more than a matter of distance. It was a wall of salt, sand, and altitude. Hauling a multi-ton locomotive out of the yard required labor, fuel, and equipment that simply did not exist in the Altiplano. Calculations scribbled in the margins of ledgers show the futility. The cost to move a single engine outstripped any possible return. In the end, the graveyard was not planned. It was the sum of every canceled repair, every deferred decision, and every exhausted budget line. The engines became fixtures in the landscape, not through neglect, but through the cold arithmetic of survival. At 3,650 meters above sea level, Uyuni is more than just distant from Bolivia's cities. It is locked in by the very terrain that once made it a railway hub. There are no paved highways built for heavy haul transport across these salt flats, and no cranes or flatbed trucks that could easily move a 60-ton locomotive out of the high Andean desert. The salt flats themselves form a natural barrier, vast and blindingly white, with a crust of sodium chloride that stretches to the horizon. Beneath this surface, the ground is soft and treacherous, especially during the rainy season, when even modern vehicles risk sinking into the brine. Every route out requires crossing dozens of kilometers of uneven, shifting ground. For railway managers facing bankruptcy, the logistics were insurmountable. Company records show that hauling a single locomotive out of Uyuni would cost more than the value of its steel. No local infrastructure existed to support such an operation, and the nearest functional rail workshops lay hundreds of kilometers away, separated by mountains and desert. The engines were simply too heavy, too remote, and too numerous to move. Yet the salt flats did more than trap these machines. They began to preserve them. Uyuni's arid climate, with less than 200 millimeters of rainfall a year, slows the decay that would have rotted wood and rusted metal to dust in wetter climates. Instead, the dry air keeps the basic form of each locomotive intact, their silhouettes still recognizable after decades exposed to the elements. But this preservation comes at a cost. Winds sweeping across the Salar de Uyuni carry fine salt particles that settle on every surface. Chloride ions in the air accelerate electrochemical reactions, eating into the steel and pitting the iron. Over time, the salt forms a crust that both shields and causes corrosion, leaving deep scars and holes in the metal while preventing total collapse. A conservation scientist from the Universidad Mayor de San Andrés explains that the salt acts as a double-edged sword. It preserves the shape, but it also speeds up corrosion from the inside out. In some places, the metal is paper thin. This paradox means that while the locomotives survive as haunting relics, they are locked in a slow battle with the environment, a battle dictated by geography and chemistry as much as by history. The graveyard's isolation is both curse and safeguard. ensuring that these engines remain stranded, their fate sealed by the land that once made them indispensable. No single entity claims clear ownership of the locomotives scattered across the Uyuni salt flats. Historical records show that after the mining companies went bankrupt and the National Railway Company shifted its priorities, the question of responsibility for these rusting engines slipped through the cracks. Municipal officials in Uyuni point to a patchwork of outdated contracts and missing paperwork. Some engines were technically the property of defunct rail firms. Others fell under state control during mid-century nationalizations, while a few may have been left in legal limbo since the original owners vanished. Cost remains the main obstacle. Modern estimates put the price of removing or restoring a single locomotive at tens of thousands of dollars, often more than the value of the metal itself. The municipality lacks the budget for such an undertaking, and neither regional nor national authorities have stepped in to assume stewardship. Without a clear title or a willing investor, the engines remain unmanaged, open to visitors and vandals alike. For now, the graveyard exists in a kind of institutional vacuum, shaped as much by legal ambiguity as by the relentless arithmetic of cost. Tour groups now pull into the outskirts of Uyuni every day, drawn by the promise of the world's largest salt flat and by the spectacle of rusted locomotives stranded at its edge. The train graveyard is no longer just a field of forgotten machines. It has become a reliable source of income for local residents. The site is woven into nearly every salt flat itinerary, with tour operators bundling a stop at the graveyard into their standard packages. Estimates from the Asociación de Guías de Turismo de Uyuni put annual visitor numbers between 100,000 and 200,000 in peak years before the pandemic, with each tourist paying between $20 and $50 for a guided day tour that includes the cemetery. Local guides say that collectively, these tours generate millions of dollars in revenue for Uyuni each year, money that supports not just guides, but also drivers, hotel owners, and restaurant staff. One guide born and raised in Uyuni describes the graveyard as our inheritance. For him and many others, the abandoned engines have become a lifeline, turning industrial loss into economic opportunity. Debate over the future of the Uyuni locomotives remains unsettled. In 2015, a group of local preservationists submitted a formal proposal to convert the graveyard into an open-air railway museum, complete with interpretive signs and protected walkways. The plan, backed by a coalition of heritage advocates and the Ministry of Cultures, promised to stabilize the most significant engines and create a space for education and research. Municipal officials, however, questioned whether restoration would strip the site of its raw appeal, which many tourists seek. A local guide explained that people come for the sense of ruin. If the site is turned into a museum, we risk losing that magic. The museum proposal stalled by 2017, caught between budget shortfalls and disagreement over who should lead the project. Some stakeholders argue that leaving the locomotives untouched preserves their authenticity, while others warn that without intervention, the site will eventually vanish beneath rust and salt. For now, the graveyard stands at a crossroads, its fate suspended between memory and erosion. Long after their purpose vanished, these locomotives endure, testaments to how ambition can outlast the empires that fuel it. Bolivia's train graveyard reminds us, when industries collapse, their scars become part of the landscape. Today, as resource frontiers shift worldwide, Uyuni's rusted giants warn that what we abandon in the name of progress never truly disappears. What legacies will we leave behind? Share your thoughts below.